The Negroes have been murdered, their schools burned, and women ravaged. This is the fruit of presidential reconstruction. Testimony before the Joint Congressional Committee, 1866. To understand the horror that descended upon Memphis in the first days of May 1866, one must first understand the world in which it was born, a world trembling between the death of one era and the painful, contested birth of another. The Civil War had ended less than 13 months before. The Confederacy had collapsed, its armies dissolved, its cause buried beneath 4 years of staggering carnage. 4 million men, women, and children who had been held in bondage were now, by the grace of the 13th Amendment, legally free. But freedom on paper and freedom in practice were two vastly different things, and nowhere was that gap more violently apparent than in the American South and in the city of Memphis, Tennessee, in particular. Memphis in 1866 was a city in turmoil. Perched on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, it was a bustling commercial hub, a city that had changed hands during the war, that had been occupied by Union forces since 1862, and that now groaned under the weight of Reconstruction, the federal government's attempt to reintegrate the rebellious southern states back into the Union while simultaneously guaranteeing rights to the formerly enslaved. The city's population had exploded. Before the war, Memphis had been a mid-sized southern city of about 23,000 people. By 1866, it had swelled to somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 souls, fed in large part by an enormous influx of freed people, black men, women, and children who had walked off plantations across the region, drawn to Memphis by the promise of Union Army protection, free labor markets, and the fragile but intoxicating possibility of a new life. These freed people settled primarily in South Memphis, in a dense, ramshackle neighborhood that spread south of Beale Street and east of the river landing. They built churches. They established schools. They started businesses. They formed families. They signed labor contracts and took wages for the first time in their lives. They existed in a state of cautious, hopeful precarity, free, but surrounded on all sides by white Memphians who despised their freedom and resented their very presence. The white population of Memphis was dominated by Irish immigrants, who had been pouring into American cities for decades, fleeing famine and poverty in their homeland. In Memphis, the Irish had carved out a specific niche in the social hierarchy, above the enslaved and the free black population, but below the established Anglo-American merchant class. They were laborers, dock workers, police officers, firemen, and small tradesmen. They were also, almost universally, Democratic voters who had little sympathy for the Republican cause, fierce opponents of abolition, and deeply hostile toward the black population that now competed with them for jobs and space. The Memphis city government was essentially an Irish Democratic machine. The mayor, John Park, was Irish-born. The city's police force was composed almost entirely of Irish immigrants, many of them Confederate veterans, most of them men who viewed black Memphians not as citizens or neighbors, but as an infestation to be managed, controlled, or eliminated. And then there were the soldiers. Thousands of United States colored troops were stationed in and around Memphis in the aftermath of the war. These were black men who had fought for the Union men of the 3rd United States Colored Heavy Artillery Regiment, in particular, who were now serving out the remainder of their enlistment in occupation duty. These soldiers were armed, uniformed, and free. To the white population of Memphis, few things were more threatening or infuriating. A black man with a gun and the authority of the United States government behind him represented a complete inversion of the social order these white Memphians had always known. The Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency established in 1865 to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom, maintained a presence in Memphis. It tried to mediate disputes between white employers and black workers, to ensure fair labor contracts, to provide food relief, and to establish schools. The Bureau was chronically underfunded, undermanned, and despised by white Memphians who saw it as an instrument of northern domination. Its agents were few, its authority frequently defied, and its protection often more theoretical than real. The tension between these groups, the freed people, the black soldiers, the Irish police, and the white Democratic establishment had been building for months like steam in a sealed boiler. The explosion came on May 1, 1866. The first day of May was a Tuesday, warm and humid, the way Memphis mornings often are in late spring. The streets near South Memphis were busy. Discharged black soldiers mingled near the garrison at Fort Pickering, located at the southern end of the city. Some were still in uniform, having received their discharges just recently. Others were waiting for paperwork, for back pay, for transportation home to families in other states. The air around the fort hummed with the complicated mixture of relief and uncertainty that follows the end of any war, the feeling of what comes next. The relationship between black soldiers and the Irish-dominated Memphis police force had been deteriorating for months. There had been frequent confrontations, arrests of black soldiers on dubious charges, altercations in saloons and on street corners. The police regarded the soldiers with contempt. The soldiers, accustomed to military discipline and the authority that came with their uniform, refused to be degraded. Each side viewed the other as an existential provocation. On the afternoon of May 1st, a group of recently discharged black soldiers no longer technically under military law, now civilians were gathered at the corner of South Street and Causey Street, near the perimeter of Fort Pickering. They were talking, passing time, in no particular hurry. A group of white men drove a hack, a horse-drawn carriage through the area, and a minor confrontation occurred. Words were exchanged. The exact sequence of events that followed would be disputed for years, but the broad outlines are clear. Two Memphis police officers, David Roach and John Creighton, arrived on the scene. Whether they came in response to a complaint or simply stumbled upon the group is uncertain. What is certain is that the presence of armed, uniformed black men or men who had recently been armed and uniformed drove these officers into a fury. An argument erupted. The officers attempted to make arrests. The soldiers resisted. A shot rang out. Then another. Then several more. When the gunfire subsided, 2 police officers had been wounded. One black soldier lay dead. Another was gravely wounded. The precise question of who fired first has never been definitively answered. White witnesses said the black soldiers fired first. Black witnesses said the police drew their weapons and shot without provocation. Given the documented hostility of the Memphis police toward the black community, and the pattern of behavior that would unfold over the next 48 hours, the testimony of white police supporters deserves to be treated with considerable skepticism. But in the inflamed, racially charged atmosphere of Memphis in 1866, it did not matter who fired first. The confrontation was the spark the white community had been waiting for, consciously or not. Word spread through the Irish neighborhoods and police precincts with the speed of wildfire. The nigger soldiers had attacked white officers. It was all the justification anyone needed. By early evening, something had transformed in the streets of South Memphis. It was no longer a confrontation. It was a hunt. As darkness fell on May 1st, groups of armed white men began gathering in South Memphis. They came from the police precincts. They came from the saloons. They came from the firehouses, where Irish firemen who enjoyed a particular antipathy toward the black community armed themselves and joined the growing mob. They were not a uniformed army with orders and objectives. They were something more dangerous, a loosely organized mob animated by racial hatred and the conviction that they would face no meaningful consequences for whatever they did. General George Stoneman, the Union Army commander in Memphis, had at his disposal federal troops who could have been deployed to protect the black community. He did not deploy them that night. His reasons remain somewhat murky. He may have believed the situation would resolve itself, or he may have been reluctant to further inflame tensions by sending soldiers into the city. Whatever his reasoning, the decision was catastrophic. By leaving South Memphis unprotected, Stoneman effectively gave the mob a free hand. The attackers moved through the black neighborhoods with a systematic ferocity. They did not distinguish between former soldiers and civilians, between men and women, between the young and the old. Any black person encountered in the streets of South Memphis was a potential target. The first killings of the evening were almost random men caught on the wrong street corner, men who ran and were shot in the back, men who made the mistake of reaching for a door that wasn't unlocked. The attackers were drinking heavily, saloons had done a brisk business all afternoon, and the mob moved through the neighborhood with the particular ugly courage that whiskey provides. Black residents barricaded themselves in their homes. They shuttered windows and pushed furniture against doors and sat in terrified silence while the sounds of shouting, gunfire, and breaking glass moved through the streets outside. Some tried to flee toward Fort Pickering, hoping the military presence there would offer protection. Some reached it safely. Others were caught before they arrived. The police, who should have been restraining the mob, were instead an integral part of it. Memphis police officers moved alongside the rioters, often leading the attacks, using their badges and authority to give the violence an official imprimatur. Police recorder John C. Creighton, one of the officers who had been present at the initial confrontation, reportedly urged the mob onward with incendiary rhetoric, encouraging the men to kill every black person they could find. By midnight, South Memphis was a landscape of terror. The precise number of people killed on the first night is uncertain, the violence was chaotic and the accounting incomplete. But the foundations of a systematic massacre had been laid, and with the sunrise came not de-escalation but intensification. If the first night was a riot, the second day was something closer to a pogrom. Wednesday morning broke to find South Memphis in a state of smoldering chaos. Black residents huddled in their homes or had taken shelter with neighbors, afraid to venture out. The streets showed the evidence of the previous night's violence: broken windows, scattered belongings, the dark stains of bloodshed on unpaved roads. But the mob had not dispersed. It had merely rested, regrouped, and in some cases grown larger. As word of the previous night's events spread through the white neighborhoods of Memphis, new participants were drawn in: men who wanted a piece of what was happening, who sensed in the violence a release of something long suppressed, who came armed and ready to continue. The attacks on Wednesday were, in many ways, worse than those of the previous night. They were more deliberate. They were more organized. And they extended beyond the killing of people to the systematic destruction of everything the black community of South Memphis had built. The attackers burned schools. The freed people, who had been denied literacy under slavery on pain of death, had built or supported several schools in South Memphis with the help of Northern missionaries and the Freedmen's Bureau. Lincoln Chapel School burned. Another schoolhouse on Causey Street burned. As flames consumed these buildings, built with such effort and sacrifice, representing such radical hope, members of the mob watched and cheered. They burned churches. The black churches of South Memphis were more than religious institutions. They were community centers, meeting places, repositories of culture and collective memory. These too were put to the torch. They burned homes. Dozens of dwellings in the black neighborhood were set on fire, their occupants forced to flee or die in the flames. Some families escaped with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Others, unable to escape in time, perished. Throughout Wednesday, the killings continued. Men were shot attempting to flee burning buildings. Men were murdered in their doorways. Men were pulled from hiding places and executed. Some were beaten to death. The violence was not uniformly spontaneous. There was, in some cases, a systematic quality to it, as if lists were being consulted, scores being settled, as if men who had long harbored particular resentments against particular black residents now saw their chance to act on them. The sexual violence was savage and deliberate. At least 5 black women, and likely many more whose experiences were never recorded, were raped by members of the mob during the massacre. These attacks occurred in women's homes, in the streets, in the ruins of burned buildings. Frances Thompson and Lucy Smith, 2 black women who lived together, testified before the Congressional Committee that they were attacked by a group of men that included police officers, who raped them repeatedly and then robbed them of everything of value in their home. The committee later received testimony from at least 4 other women who described similar attacks. The sexual violence was not incidental to the massacre, it was integral to it. It was an assertion of domination, a demonstration that black women had no protection, no recourse, no rights that white men were bound to respect, an echo, deliberate or not, of the logic of slavery that the war had ostensibly ended. The Freedmen's Bureau agents in Memphis were largely powerless. Agents who attempted to intervene were threatened, some were physically assaulted. One agent, a northern man named Runkle, reportedly pleaded with General Stoneman to deploy troops, only to be turned away. Stoneman remained at his headquarters, issuing no orders, deploying no soldiers. Mayor John Park was equally useless. He appeared in South Memphis briefly on Wednesday but made no serious attempt to restrain the mob. He declared that the violence was the fault of the black community, that the freed people had provoked the attacks, that order would be restored, and then he returned to his office and did nothing of consequence. The city government was not merely failing to protect its black residents, in many cases, it was actively participating in their murder. As Wednesday evening approached, South Memphis was burning in earnest. The glow of the fires was visible from the other side of the Mississippi River. Refugees streamed toward Fort Pickering, carrying children and whatever possessions they could salvage, leaving behind homes and churches and schools that had represented everything they had built in freedom. By Thursday, May 3rd, the violence was beginning to exhaust itself, as such violence always comes not from any moral reckoning, but from the simple limits of human energy and the depletion of obvious targets. General Stoneman had finally, belatedly, ordered federal troops into South Memphis during the late hours of Wednesday. Whether it was the scale of the destruction, pressure from Freedmen's Bureau officials, or belated conscience that moved him, the troops arrived and began imposing a semblance of order. By Thursday morning, the worst of the killing had stopped, though isolated incidents of violence and theft continued throughout the day. What remained was the aftermath, and the aftermath was almost incomprehensible in its devastation. The final toll, as documented by the Congressional Committee that would investigate the massacre in the weeks that followed, was staggering. 46 black people were dead. More than 70 had been wounded. 5 black women had been raped. 90 homes had been burned. 4 black churches had been destroyed. 12 black schools had been burned to the ground. 2 white men had died, both apparently killed by other white men in the confusion of the mob violence. The destruction of the schools and churches was particularly catastrophic. These institutions had been built with money scraped together by the freed people themselves, with donations from northern missionary societies, with the labor of men and women who had been denied education their entire lives. Some of the school buildings had been standing for less than a year. All of it was ash. The economic devastation was similarly severe. The black community of South Memphis had been accumulating, with painstaking effort, the material foundations of independent life savings, furniture, tools, livestock, the modest beginnings of property ownership. The mob had stolen or destroyed virtually everything. Families who had been working their way toward stability were left destitute. And yet the violence was not random in its target selection. The mob had not attacked the white establishment of Memphis. It had not attacked the wealthy merchants or the riverboat operators or the cotton factors who controlled the economic life of the city. It had attacked the most vulnerable, the most newly free, the people who had the least protection and the most to lose. It had attacked, with particular ferocity, the symbols of black progress, the schools that represented literacy, the churches that represented community and spiritual autonomy, the homes that represented independence from white control. This was not an accident. It was a message, written in blood and fire, about who Memphis belonged to and who was permitted to thrive within it. Among the rubble and ash, the survivors told their stories. Their testimony, collected by the Congressional Investigating Committee in May and June of 1866, stands as one of the most important bodies of witness literature from the Reconstruction era, a set of voices that the nation tried very hard, for many subsequent decades, to silence or ignore. Adam Locke was a black man who had served in the Union Army and was working as a laborer in South Memphis at the time of the massacre. He testified that on the night of May 1st, he had been at home when a group of white men, including police officers, arrived at his door. They demanded entry. When he tried to bar the door, they broke it down and dragged him into the street. They beat him severely. They then demanded to know where he kept his money. When he told them he had none, they beat him again. They found $11, his savings, and took it. Then they shot him and left him for dead. He survived, barely, by playing dead in the street until the men moved on. Rachel Dilts, a white woman who lived in South Memphis near several black families, testified that she had seen police officers leading groups of men through the neighborhood, that she had heard officers giving orders to attack specific homes, and that she had personally witnessed the murder of at least 2 black men by men she recognized as city police. Her testimony was considered remarkable not only for its content but for the fact that she, a white woman, was willing to give it at all. Cynthia Townsend, a freed woman, testified that her husband had been dragged from their home and shot to death in front of her and her children. She had then been forced to flee with her children as the house was set on fire around her. She had lost everything, her husband, her home, her few possessions. She did not know how she would survive. Henry Porter, a recently discharged soldier, testified that he had been with a group of other black men near Fort Pickering when white attackers opened fire on them without warning. 2 of his companions were killed instantly. He had run and hidden in a drainage ditch, lying motionless in the mud and filth for hours while the sounds of violence played out around him. He had survived by keeping absolutely still. These testimonies, and dozens more like them, were gathered by the Joint Select Committee on the Memphis Riots, a congressional body dispatched to Memphis within weeks of the massacre. The committee's report, released in July 1866, is a remarkable document, a meticulous accounting of atrocity, compiled through careful investigation at a time when the nation was deeply divided about what Reconstruction should look like and how vigorously the rights of freed people should be protected. The committee's conclusions were unsparing. It found that the Memphis police had not merely failed to prevent the violence, they had instigated, participated in, and in some cases led it. It found that the mayor and city government were complicit. It found that General Stoneman had been derelict in his duty by failing to deploy troops sooner. And it found, in language that was careful but unmistakable, that the massacre had been driven by racial hatred, by the desire of Memphis's white democratic establishment to terrorize the black community into submission and to demonstrate, viscerally and violently, that freedom did not mean equality. The Memphis Massacre of 1866 did not occur in isolation. It was one of several major outbreaks of anti-black violence in the South during this period, the most significant being the New Orleans Massacre of July 1866, in which at least 34 black people and 3 white radical Republicans were killed by a mob that included New Orleans police officers. Together, these events shook Northern public opinion in ways that years of more abstract political argument had failed to do. They provided visceral, documented proof that the South's white leadership, the same men who had led the Confederacy, who had been pardoned by President Andrew Johnson, who were now being welcomed back into positions of power through Johnson's lenient Reconstruction policies, had absolutely no intention of respecting the rights of the freed people. The political consequences were enormous. President Andrew Johnson had staked his Reconstruction policy on the idea that the Southern states could be trusted to manage the transition from slavery to freedom without significant federal intervention, provided they agreed to formally rejoin the Union and ratify the 13th Amendment. The Memphis and New Orleans massacres exposed this policy as catastrophically naive, or worse, as a deliberate abandonment of the freed people to the mercy of their former enslavers. The congressional elections of November 1866 became a referendum on Reconstruction policy. The radical Republicans, those members of Congress who argued for aggressive federal protection of black rights, for military oversight of the South, for the disenfranchisement of unreconstructed Confederates, won a massive, veto-proof majority. This electoral landslide ushered in the period known as Radical Reconstruction, or Congressional Reconstruction, a fundamentally different approach to the post-war South. The Memphis Massacre also accelerated the push for what would become the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment, ratified in 1868, established birthright citizenship, guaranteed equal protection under the law, and prohibited states from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. It was, in part, a direct legislative response to the documented reality that state governments, like the government of Memphis, Tennessee, could not be trusted to protect the lives and rights of black Americans. The testimony gathered in Memphis was reprinted in newspapers across the North. It was read aloud in Congress. It was distributed in pamphlets by abolitionist organizations. The names of Francis Thompson and Lucy Smith, of Adam Locke, of the dozens of others who testified, were known to hundreds of thousands of Americans. For a brief, flickering moment, the nation confronted what it had permitted to happen. And then, gradually, it tried to forget. The arc of American racial history in the decades following Reconstruction is, among other things, a history of deliberate forgetting. As Reconstruction gave way to redemption, as Southern Democrats redeemed their states from Republican governance through a combination of violence, fraud, and intimidation, the achievements of the Reconstruction era were dismantled one by one. Black men who had been elected to Congress and state legislatures were driven from office. Schools built for freed people were closed or degraded. The 14th and 15th Amendments remained on the books but were rendered nearly meaningless by a combination of local terror and federal indifference. The massacre itself faded from public memory. It was not included in the history books used in Memphis schools or Tennessee schools for generations. The names of the victims were not commemorated. The sites of the burned churches and schools were built over, and the new structures bore no markers acknowledging what had happened there. The perpetrators faced no consequences. No Memphis police officer was ever prosecuted for any crime committed during the 3 days of the massacre. No city official was held accountable. Mayor John Park was not removed from office. The men who raped, murdered, and burned their way through South Memphis in May of 1866 returned to their normal lives and, in many cases, continued to be respected members of their community. This impunity was not incidental. It was, in a profound sense, the point. The massacre had been intended to demonstrate that white Memphis could do whatever it wished to the black community, without fear of consequence. The subsequent failure to prosecute a single perpetrator confirmed this lesson with the authority of the legal system. The survivors and their descendants carried the memory forward, as marginalized communities always do in oral history, in church records, in the hard-won institutional memory of the black community of Memphis. But this memory was not allowed into the mainstream of American historical consciousness. It was suppressed, ignored, trivialized, or simply never taught. It was not until the late 20th century that serious scholarly attention began to return to the Memphis Massacre of 1866. Historians like James Gilbert Ryan and Altina Waller produced careful, documented accounts of the events. The testimony of the Congressional Committee, long buried in government archives, was brought back to light. Memphis itself began, slowly and incompletely, to grapple with what had happened within its limits. The neighborhood that was the epicenter of the Memphis Massacre has changed many times in the century and a half since those terrible 3 days in May 1866. The ramshackle wooden houses of the freed people are long gone, replaced by other structures, which have themselves been built over and replaced. For much of the 20th century, there was no marker, no plaque, no formal acknowledgement of what had happened in South Memphis in 1866. The violence was treated as if it had never occurred, the victims as if they had never lived. In recent decades, that has begun to change. Memphis has undertaken, haltingly and incompletely, the kind of reckoning with its own history that American cities often find extremely difficult. Scholars have lectured and written. Community organizations have organized commemorations. Efforts have been made to identify the sites associated with the massacre and to mark them in some way. In 2016, on the 150th anniversary of the massacre, the city of Memphis held a series of events commemorating the victims and acknowledging the historical significance of the events of May 1 to 3, 1866. Memphis Mayor Carl Dean and other officials attended ceremonies at sites connected to the massacre. It was, by the standards of such commemorations, a meaningful gesture, though many participants were quick to note that acknowledgement, however sincere, cannot substitute for the deeper work of confronting how the patterns of racial violence and inequality documented in 1866 have continued to shape the city and the nation in the generations since. The 46 people who were murdered in South Memphis in those 3 days in May 1866, most of whom died without any formal record of their names, without any marker at their place of death, without any promise that their deaths would be remembered or their killers brought to justice, deserve better than footnotes. They deserve to be understood as full human beings whose lives had value and whose deaths had meaning, whose suffering was not merely a historical data point but a human catastrophe of the first order. They were people who had survived slavery, who had lived through a war, who had built something, families, communities, schools, churches, a fragile, precious, hard-won beginning on the other side of bondage. And who were murdered for having done so. Their names, where we have them, deserve to be spoken. Their stories, where we have them, deserve to be told. Their massacre deserves to be remembered not as a distant historical curiosity but as a vivid, documented illustration of what racial hatred looks like when it is given permission to act, and as a warning, as relevant today as it was 158 years ago, about what happens when the institutions charged with protecting the vulnerable choose, instead, to destroy them.